The Inconvenient Truth. The Great Flood, a story of divine retribution and humanity's salvation, has been etched in human consciousness for millennia. It's a tale of a wrathful God, a righteous Noah, and a devastating deluge that wiped out the wickedness of humanity. But what if this familiar narrative conceals a more complex, inconvenient truth? The biblical account, our most well-known version, presents contradictions and inconsistencies. The story goes that God, displeased with humanity's corruption, decided to destroy the world with a flood, saving only Noah and his family. However, this raises questions. If God created humanity, is he not responsible for their wickedness? Why spare Noah, a descendant of Adam, if the entire human race was corrupt? How did Noah's Ark accommodate the vast diversity of species, including dinosaurs and other extinct creatures? What about the innocent lives lost, including women, children, and the marginalized? These queries hint at a more intricate truth, one that challenges the simplistic narrative of divine punishment and heroic salvation. It's time to delve deeper, beyond the surface of this ancient story, and uncover the inconvenient truths hidden beneath. The historical context. The Great Flood myth originated in ancient Mesopotamia, a region of present-day Iraq, around 4,500 years ago. This was an era of city-states, kingdoms, and empires, where power struggles and political intrigue were commonplace. The ruling elite controlled the flow of resources, information, and, most importantly, water. Flood control was a critical issue in this region, as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers frequently overflowed, threatening cities and crops. The construction of massive flood control projects, such as dams, canals, and levees, was essential for the survival and prosperity of these civilizations. The politics of flood control. It's possible that the Great Flood myth was used to justify these massive infrastructure projects, consolidating power and wealth for the ruling elite. By attributing the flood to divine wrath, the rulers could claim a moral imperative for their actions, positioning themselves as the chosen ones, tasked with saving humanity from destruction. This political context sheds light on the story's inconsistencies and contradictions. The biblical account, written by the victors, may have been a tool for legitimizing their authority, masking the brutal realities of power struggles and the exploitation of the masses. The forgotten victims. The traditional narrative focuses on Noah and his family, the chosen ones, while the countless lives lost in the flood remain nameless, faceless, and forgotten. The story's emphasis on divine punishment overshadows the human cost, perpetuating a culture of victim blaming and moral superiority. The flood's impact on women, children, and marginalized communities is particularly disturbing. These vulnerable groups would have been disproportionately affected, their voices and stories silenced by the dominant narrative. It's essential to acknowledge and honor their memories, challenging the problematic notion of divine violence that condones the suffering of innocence. Conclusion. The Great Flood, a story we thought we knew, holds secrets and contradictions that demand a closer examination. By questioning the dominant narrative and exploring the historical context, we uncover an inconvenient truth, a complex web of power struggles, political intrigue, and human suffering. In the next chapter, we'll delve deeper into the ancient politics of flood control, revealing how the myth may have been used to justify the construction of massive infrastructure projects, consolidating power and wealth for the ruling elite. The story of the Great Flood is far from simple. It's time to confront the inconvenient truths and uncover the hidden complexities of this ancient, thought-provoking tale. The ancient politics of flood control. The Great Flood myth, as we've seen, originated in ancient Mesopotamia, a region of present-day Iraq, around 4,500 years ago. This was an era of city-states, kingdoms, and empires, where power struggles and political intrigue were commonplace. The ruling elite controlled the flow of resources, information, and, most importantly, water. Flood control was a critical issue in this region, as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers frequently overflowed, threatening cities and crops. The rise of the city-states. In the 4th millennium BCE, Mesopotamia was a land of city-states, each with its own government, economy, and culture. These city-states were often at odds with one another, vying for control of the fertile plains and access to the rivers. The most powerful city-states, such as Uruk, Uar, and Nippur, were ruled by kings and priest-kings, who claimed divine authority and controlled the flow of resources. The importance of flood control. Flood control was essential for the survival and prosperity of these city-states. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which flowed through the region, were prone to seasonal flooding, which could be devastating. A single flood could destroy crops, damage buildings, and disrupt trade and commerce. The ruling elite recognized the importance of flood control and invested heavily in infrastructure projects, such as dams, canals, and levees, to mitigate the effects of flooding. The role of the temple priests. The temple priests played a crucial role in the politics of flood control. They were not only religious leaders but also administrators, engineers, and scientists. They oversaw the construction and maintenance of flood control projects, ensuring that the city-states were protected from the ravages of flooding. The temple priests also developed sophisticated systems of irrigation, which allowed for the cultivation of crops in the fertile plains. The myth of the Great Flood. It's against this backdrop of political intrigue, power struggles, and flood control that the myth of the Great Flood emerged. The story, as we know it, tells of a divine decision to destroy the world with a flood, saving only Noah and his family. However, this narrative may have been used to justify the construction of massive flood control projects, consolidating power and wealth for the ruling elite. The connection to flood control. The myth of the Great Flood shares striking similarities with the flood control projects of ancient Mesopotamia. The story of Noah's Ark, for example, bears a resemblance to the construction of massive boats and barges used in flood control. The Ark's dimensions, as described in the biblical account, match the proportions of ancient Mesopotamian boats. Moreover, the story of the Great Flood contains details that mirror the experiences of ancient Mesopotamians. The flood's duration, 40 days and 40 nights, corresponds to the typical flooding season in Mesopotamia. The story's emphasis on the destruction of the wicked and the salvation of the righteous may have been used to justify the displacement of marginalized communities and the concentration of power in the hands of the ruling elite. The politics of divine intervention. The myth of the Great Flood also served as a tool for political legitimation. By attributing the flood to divine intervention, the ruling elite could claim a moral imperative for their actions, positioning themselves as the chosen ones, tasked with saving humanity from destruction. This narrative allowed them to justify their power and authority, as well as their control over the flow of resources and information. The legacy of the Great Flood. The myth of the Great Flood has had a profound impact on human culture and history. It has shaped our understanding of the natural world, our relationship with the divine, and our responses to disaster and trauma. However, it's essential to recognize the political context in which this myth emerged and the ways in which it has been used to justify power and control. In the next chapter, we'll explore the devastating impact of the flood on innocent people, including women, children, and marginalized communities, and challenge the traditional narrative's emphasis on divine punishment and heroic salvation. We'll examine the concept of divine violence and its problematic implications, and uncover the hidden stories of those who suffered and survived the Great Flood. The Forgotten Victims. The Great Flood, a story of divine retribution and heroic salvation, has captivated human imagination for millennia. However, this familiar narrative conceals a darker truth: the devastating impact on innocent people, including women, children, and marginalized communities. The traditional account focuses on Noah and his family, the chosen ones, while the countless lives lost in the flood remain nameless, faceless, and forgotten. The human cost of the flood. The flood's destruction was not limited to the physical environment. It also had a profound impact on human societies. The disaster would have resulted in the displacement of entire communities, the loss of livelihoods, and the disruption of social structures. The psychological trauma caused by the flood would have been immense, with survivors struggling to come to terms with the scale of the devastation. The plight of women and children. Women and children would have been particularly vulnerable in the aftermath of the flood. In ancient societies, they were often relegated to the margins, with limited access to resources, power, and protection. The flood would have exacerbated their vulnerability, leaving them exposed to violence, exploitation, and displacement. The story of the Great Flood is silent on the fate of women and children, except for the brief mention of Noah's wife and his 3 sons' wives. This omission is telling, reflecting the patriarchal bias of the narrative. The voices and experiences of women and children are absent, their stories lost in the deluge. The marginalized communities. The Great Flood would have also affected marginalized communities, including the poor, the elderly, and the infirm. These groups would have been disproportionately affected by the disaster, with limited access to resources, shelter, and protection. The flood would have exacerbated their vulnerability, pushing them further to the margins of society. The traditional narrative ignores the experiences of these communities, focusing instead on the story of Noah and his family. This omission perpetuates the invisibility of marginalized groups, reinforcing the dominant power structures of ancient societies. The concept of divine violence. The Great Flood myth perpetuates a problematic concept: divine violence. This idea posits that God, or a higher power, is justified in inflicting violence and destruction on humanity. The flood is presented as a punishment for humanity's wickedness, with God's wrath exacted on the innocent and the guilty alike. Divine violence has far-reaching implications, legitimizing the use of force and coercion in the name of a higher power. This concept has been used throughout history to justify violence, oppression, and discrimination, perpetuating a culture of fear and submission. Challenging the traditional narrative. It's essential to challenge the traditional narrative of the Great Flood, recognizing the forgotten victims and the devastating impact of the disaster. By acknowledging the human cost of the flood, we can begin to confront the problematic concept of divine violence and its legacy in our cultures and societies. Uncovering the hidden stories. The Great Flood myth contains hidden stories, waiting to be uncovered. The stories of women, children, and marginalized communities, though absent from the traditional narrative, can be reconstructed through historical and archaeological research. By listening to these voices, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of the flood's impact and the resilience of human societies. Conclusion. The Great Flood, a story of divine retribution and heroic salvation, conceals a darker truth: the devastating impact on innocent people, including women, children, and marginalized communities. By challenging the traditional narrative and uncovering the hidden stories, we can begin to confront the problematic concept of divine violence and its legacy in our cultures and societies. In the next chapter, we'll explore the ecological consequences of the flood, including the destruction of habitats, extinction of species, and disruption of natural cycles, and question the morality of a deity who would inflict such destruction on the natural world. The environmental catastrophe. The Great Flood, a story of divine retribution and heroic salvation, has a darker, more sinister side: the ecological consequences of the disaster. The flood's destruction was not limited to human societies. It also had a profound impact on the natural world. The disaster would have resulted in the destruction of habitats, the extinction of species, and the disruption of natural cycles. The destruction of habitats. The flood would have destroyed entire ecosystems, including forests, grasslands, and wetlands. The rising waters would have inundated habitats, killing plants and animals, and disrupting the delicate balance of ecosystems. The destruction of habitats would have had a ripple effect, impacting species that relied on those ecosystems for survival. The extinction of species. The Great Flood would have led to the extinction of numerous species. The disaster would have killed off entire populations, leaving no survivors to repopulate. The extinction of species would have had a profound impact on the natural world, disrupting the food chain and ecosystem balance. The disruption of natural cycles. The flood would have disrupted natural cycles, including the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nutrient cycle. The disaster would have altered the Earth's climate, leading to changes in temperature, precipitation, and weather patterns. The disruption of natural cycles would have had far-reaching consequences, impacting the entire planet. The morality of divine destruction. The Great Flood myth raises questions about the morality of divine destruction. If God or a higher power is responsible for the flood, does that mean that the destruction of the natural world is justified? Is the extinction of species, the destruction of habitats, and the disruption of natural cycles acceptable if it serves a divine purpose? The implications of divine destruction. The concept of divine destruction has far-reaching implications. If God or a higher power is responsible for the flood, does that mean that human actions that harm the environment are justified? Does it mean that we can ignore the consequences of our actions, knowing that a higher power will intervene to restore balance? The responsibility of humanity. The Great Flood myth highlights the responsibility of humanity towards the natural world. We are not innocent bystanders, but active participants in the destruction of the environment. Our actions, or lack thereof, have consequences for the planet and its inhabitants. The need for environmental stewardship. The Great Flood myth emphasizes the need for environmental stewardship. We must recognize the value of the natural world and take steps to protect it. We must be mindful of our actions and their consequences, working to mitigate the harm we cause. Conclusion. The Great Flood, a story of divine retribution and heroic salvation, has a darker, more sinister side: the ecological consequences of the disaster. The flood's destruction was not limited to human societies. It also had a profound impact on the natural world. By recognizing the environmental catastrophe caused by the flood, we can begin to take responsibility for our actions and work towards environmental stewardship. In the next chapter, we'll explore the symbolism and significance of Noah's Ark, arguing that it represents a patriarchal, authoritarian, and exclusivist worldview, and examine how this narrative has been used to justify oppression and discrimination throughout history. Chapter 5. Hidden Agenda of the Ark. Noah's Ark, the iconic vessel that saved humanity and animal life from the Great Flood, is often seen as a symbol of salvation, hope, and new beginnings. However, a closer examination of the Ark's story reveals a more complex and problematic narrative, one that perpetuates a patriarchal, authoritarian, and exclusivist worldview. The patriarchal narrative. The story of the Ark is deeply patriarchal, with Noah, the male protagonist, taking center stage. He is the one who receives the divine instructions, builds the Ark, and saves his family and the animals. The women in the story, including Noah's wife and his daughters-in-law, are relegated to the background, their voices and agency silenced. This patriarchal narrative reinforces the dominant gender dynamics of ancient societies, where men held power and women were marginalized. The Ark story perpetuates this gender imbalance, reinforcing the idea that men are the leaders, decision-makers, and saviors, while women are passive and subordinate. The authoritarian message. The Ark story also contains an authoritarian message, with God's instructions to Noah being absolute and unquestionable. Noah is not encouraged to question or challenge God's commands. Instead, he is expected to obey without hesitation. This narrative reinforces the idea that authority is absolute, and those in power must be obeyed without question. This authoritarian message has been used throughout history to justify oppressive regimes, dictatorships, and totalitarian systems. The Ark story perpetuates the idea that those in power have a divine right to rule, and that dissent or disobedience is sinful and punishable. The exclusivist worldview. The Ark story is also exclusivist, with only Noah and his family being saved from the flood. The rest of humanity, including those who may have been innocent or righteous, are left to perish. This narrative reinforces the idea that only a select few are worthy of salvation, while the majority are condemned to destruction. This exclusivist worldview has been used throughout history to justify discrimination, oppression, and violence against marginalized groups. The Ark story perpetuates the idea that some lives are more valuable than others, and that those who are different or outside the dominant group are expendable. The legacy of the Ark. The Ark story has had a profound impact on human culture and history. It has been used to justify patriarchal, authoritarian, and exclusivist systems, perpetuating oppression and discrimination against marginalized groups. The Ark's narrative has also been used to reinforce the idea that humanity is separate from the natural world, and that our actions have no consequences for the environment. However, it's not too late to challenge and subvert the Ark's narrative. we can recognize the problematic elements of the story and work to create a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable worldview. We can question authority, challenge patriarchal norms, and work towards a more just and compassionate society. Conclusion: the Ark story, often seen as a symbol of salvation and hope, contains a more complex and problematic narrative. The patriarchal, authoritarian, and exclusivist elements of the story have been used throughout history to justify oppression and discrimination. However, by recognizing and challenging these elements, we can work towards a more inclusive and equitable society, one that values the voices and agency of all individuals, regardless of gender, race, or background. In the next chapter, we'll explore the stories of other flood legends from around the world, highlighting the diversity of human experiences and resilience. Chapter 6: Unseen Heroes. The Great Flood, a story of divine retribution and heroic salvation, has captivated human imagination for millennia. However, this familiar narrative conceals a more complex and diverse history, one that highlights the resilience and courage of unseen heroes. The flood legends of the world. Flood legends are found in cultures and civilizations around the world, each with its unique story and heroes. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of Utnapishtim, who survived the flood with his family and animals. In ancient Greece, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha describes how they repopulate the earth after the flood. In India, the Mahabharata tells the story of Manu, who saved the world from the Great Flood. These flood legends share a common thread: the resilience and courage of humanity in the face of disaster. They highlight the unseen heroes, who against all odds, survived and thrived in the aftermath of the flood. The story of Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim, the hero of the Epic of Gilgamesh, was a king who ruled over the city of Shuruppak. When the gods decided to send the flood, Utnapishtim was warned by the god Ea and instructed to build a boat to save himself, his family, and the animals. The flood lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, and when it subsided, Utnapishtim released a dove, a swallow, and a raven to determine if the floodwaters had receded. Utnapishtim's story is a testament to the power of human resilience and determination. He faced the impossible task of saving his family and the animals from the flood, and through his courage and ingenuity, he succeeded. The story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Deucalion and Pyrrha, the heroes of ancient Greece, were the only survivors of the Great Flood. They were instructed by the god Zeus to repopulate the earth by throwing stones behind them, which would become humans. Deucalion and Pyrrha obeyed, and soon the earth was populated with humans. Their story highlights the importance of hope and resilience in the face of disaster. Despite the devastation of the flood, Deucalion and Pyrrha found a way to start anew and rebuild their world. The story of Manu. Manu, the hero of the Mahabharata, was a wise and just king who ruled over the earth. When the Great Flood came, Manu was warned by the god Brahma and instructed to build a boat to save himself and the animals. The flood lasted for a year, and when it subsided, Manu released the animals and repopulate the earth. Manu's story is a testament to the power of wisdom and compassion. He faced the impossible task of saving the world from the flood, and through his wisdom and kindness, he succeeded. The unseen heroes of the flood. The stories of Utnapishtim, Deucalion and Pyrrha, and Manu highlight the unseen heroes of the flood. They were ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances, and through their courage, resilience, and determination, they survived and thrived. Their stories are a reminder that heroism is not limited to grand actions or grandiose gestures. Heroism can be found in the everyday acts of courage, kindness, and compassion that people show in the face of adversity. Conclusion: The Great Flood, a story of divine retribution and heroic salvation, has a more complex and diverse history than we often acknowledge. The flood legends of the world highlight the resilience and courage of unseen heroes, who against all odds, survived and thrived in the aftermath of the flood. Their stories are a testament to the power of human resilience and determination, and a reminder that heroism can be found in the everyday acts of courage, kindness, and compassion that people show in the face of adversity. In the next chapter, we'll explore the divine dilemma of the Great Flood, confronting the ethical contradictions of a deity who punishes humanity for its wickedness, while also being responsible for creating humanity in the first place. Chapter 7. Welcome to the most controversial chapter of the Bible, the story of Noah's Arkansas. A tale of salvation and destruction, of faith and doubt, of humanity's darkest hour and God's most mysterious decision. For centuries, this story has sparked debate and curiosity, leaving us with more questions than answers. How can a deity who punishes humanity for its wickedness also be responsible for creating humanity in the first place? This divine dilemma has puzzled scholars and theologians for centuries, and its implications are far-reaching and complex. The problem of evil. The Great Flood is often seen as a solution to the problem of evil, where a benevolent deity eliminates wickedness and corruption from the world. However, this solution raises more questions than it answers. If God created humanity, why did he create us with the capacity for evil? And if he is all-powerful, why did he not prevent evil from arising in the first place? The free will defense. One possible answer to this dilemma is the free will defense, which argues that God gave humanity the gift of free will, allowing us to choose between good and evil. This defense assumes that humanity's capacity for evil is a necessary consequence of our freedom, and that God's creation of us with this capacity is justified because it allows for the possibility of moral growth and development. However, this defense raises further questions. If God knew that humanity would use its free will to commit evil, why did he not intervene to prevent it? And if he did intervene, as in the case of the Great Flood, why did he not do so earlier, before the wickedness had a chance to spread? The sovereignty of God. Another possible answer to this dilemma is the sovereignty of God, which argues that God's ways are not our ways, and that his justice and mercy are beyond human comprehension. This answer assumes that God's creation of humanity, including our capacity for evil, is part of a larger plan that we cannot fully understand. However, this answer raises further questions. If God's ways are beyond our comprehension, why did he reveal himself to us in the first place? And if his justice and mercy are beyond our understanding, how can we trust in his goodness and love? The moral implications. The divine dilemma of the Great Flood has far-reaching moral implications. If God is responsible for creating humanity with the capacity for evil, does that mean that he is also responsible for the evil that we commit? And if he is not responsible, then who is? Moreover, if God punishes humanity for its wickedness, does that mean that he is a just and fair God, or a vengeful and capricious one? And if he is just and fair, then why did he not punish the wickedness of the world before it spread, rather than waiting until it had reached a catastrophic level? The conclusion. The divine dilemma of the Great Flood is a complex and profound ethical question that has puzzled scholars and theologians for centuries. The problem of evil, the free will defense, and the sovereignty of God are all possible answers to this dilemma, but each raises further questions and moral implications. Ultimately, the divine dilemma of the Great Flood challenges our understanding of God's nature and his relationship with humanity. It forces us to confront the ethical contradictions of a deity who punishes humanity for its wickedness while also being responsible for creating humanity in the first place. And it invites us to explore the deeper moral implications of this dilemma, and to seek a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of God's justice and mercy. Chapter 8. Unveiling the truth behind the story of Noah's Ark. The story of Noah's Ark is one of the most well-known stories in the Bible, but it's also one of the most controversial. While many people see it as a tale of salvation and redemption, others have raised questions about its historical accuracy and moral implications. In this chapter, we'll delve into the controversy surrounding the story of Noah's Ark and explore what people may not know about it. Historical accuracy. One of the biggest controversies surrounding the story of Noah's Ark is its historical accuracy. While the Bible describes the flood as a global event that wiped out all life on Earth, many scientists and historians have questioned its validity. Scientific criticisms. Scientists have raised several criticisms about the story of Noah's Ark. For example, the flood described in the Bible would have required an enormous amount of water, far more than the Earth's oceans could hold. The story claims that the flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights, but this would have been impossible given the Earth's geography and climate. The story also claims that Noah's Ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, but this mountain is not high enough to have been above water during a global flood. Historical criticisms. Historians have also raised several criticisms about the story of Noah's Ark. For example, there is no historical evidence to support the idea of a global flood. The story of Noah's Ark bears striking similarities to other flood legends from ancient Mesopotamia, leading some to believe that it may have been borrowed from these earlier stories. Moral implications. Another controversy surrounding the story of Noah's Ark is its moral implications. While the story portrays God as a benevolent being who saves Noah and his family, it also depicts him as a vengeful God who destroys the rest of humanity without mercy. Critics' arguments. Critics argue that the story of Noah's Ark raises several moral concerns, including the idea of a God who would destroy innocent people, including children and animals, without mercy, the idea of a God who would choose to save only one family while condemning the rest of humanity to death. Treatment of women. The story of Noah's Ark also raises questions about the treatment of women. While Noah's wife and daughters are mentioned in the story, they are largely absent from the narrative and play no significant role. Feminist criticisms. Feminist critics argue that the story of Noah's Ark perpetuates patriarchal attitudes and reinforces gender inequality. For example, the story portrays women as secondary characters, with no agency or voice. The story also portrays women as being subordinate to men, with Noah's wife and daughters being depicted as obedient and submissive. Animal sacrifice. The story of Noah's Ark also involves animal sacrifice, which has been a controversial topic throughout history. While the story portrays animal sacrifice as a necessary act to appease God, many people today see it as cruel and unnecessary. Animal welfare concerns. Animal welfare advocates argue that the story of Noah's Ark raises several concerns about animal cruelty, including the idea of sacrificing animals as a means of appeasing God, the idea of keeping animals in captivity for long periods of time without proper care or consideration for their welfare, environmental impact. Finally, the story of Noah's Ark raises questions about the environmental impact of the flood. While the story portrays the flood as a natural disaster, many scientists today see it as a warning about the dangers of climate change and the importance of protecting the environment. Environmental concerns. Environmentalists argue that the story of Noah's Ark raises several concerns about the environment, including the idea of a global flood that destroys all life on Earth, highlighting the importance of preserving biodiversity. The idea of a God who would destroy the Earth, highlighting the importance of protecting the environment and preserving natural resources. Conclusion. In conclusion, the story of Noah's Ark is a complex and controversial topic that raises many questions about its historical accuracy, moral implications, and treatment of women and animals. While it remains a popular story in many cultures, it's important to approach it with a critical eye and consider the different perspectives and interpretations that exist. The story of Babel is a complex and multifaceted one, with many layers of meaning and interpretation. To break it down in great detail, let's start with the historical context in which the story takes place. The historical context. The story of Babel takes place in the aftermath of the Great Flood, which is said to have wiped out all of humanity except for Noah and his family. After the flood, Noah's descendants began to repopulate the earth, and as they grew in number, they began to build a great city and a tower that would reach the heavens. The City of Babel. The City of Babel was a marvel of human ingenuity and skill, a testament to the power and creativity of humanity. But it was also a symbol of human pride and arrogance, a monument to the idea that humanity could achieve anything it set its mind to, without the need for God or divine guidance. The Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was the crowning achievement of the city, a towering structure that was meant to reach the heavens and assert humanity's dominance over the divine. But it was also a symbol of oppression and slavery, as the people of Babel were forced to work long hours in brutal conditions to build the tower, under the harsh rule of King Nimrod. King Nimrod. King Nimrod was a ruthless and power-hungry leader who used his people to build his own empire. He was a skilled hunter and warrior, but also a cruel and oppressive ruler who cared little for the welfare of his people. He was determined to build a tower that would reach the heavens and prove his own greatness, and he would stop at nothing to achieve his goal. The confusion of language. As the people of Babel worked on the tower, God saw their pride and arrogance and decided to confuse their language so that they could no longer understand one another. This was not just a punishment, but also a liberation, as the people of Babel were finally able to break free from Nimrod's rule and forge their own paths. The scattering of humanity. The confusion of language led to the scattering of humanity, as people began to move away from the city of Babel and form their own communities. This was not just a result of God's confusion of language, but also a result of the people's desire for freedom and autonomy. They were no longer willing to be enslaved by Nimrod and his empire. The legacy of Babel. The city of Babel was left abandoned, a reminder of the dangers of oppression and the importance of freedom and autonomy. The story of Babel serves as a warning to those who would seek to exploit and enslave others, and a reminder of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest challenges. The symbolism of the Tower. The Tower of Babel is a powerful symbol of human pride and arrogance, a reminder of the dangers of seeking to assert our dominance over the divine. It is also a symbol of oppression and slavery, a reminder of the importance of standing up against tyranny and fighting for our freedom and autonomy. The significance of the confusion of language. The confusion of language is a powerful symbol of the importance of communication and understanding. It reminds us that language is a powerful tool, and that it can be used to build bridges or to create divisions. It also reminds us that we are all equal, and that no one language or culture is superior to another. The message of the story. The story of Babel is a powerful reminder of the importance of humility and the dangers of pride and arrogance. It reminds us that we are all equal, and that we should strive to build each other up, rather than tearing each other down. It also reminds us of the importance of standing up against oppression and fighting for our freedom and autonomy. In conclusion, the story of Babel is a complex and multifaceted one, with many layers of meaning and interpretation. It is a reminder of the dangers of oppression and the importance of freedom and autonomy, and it serves as a warning to those who would seek to exploit and enslave others. It is also a reminder of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest challenges, and of the importance of humility and communication in building a better world.